Hello and welcome once again to the Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Haldane. On this episode, I'm going to be speaking to literary editor of The Spectator, Sam Leith, about his new book, The Haunted Wood, A History of Childhood Reading. It's not every episode that a guest chooses a high street chain like Pizza Express, so welcome, Sam, to the League of Normies.
Thank you, yes, the League of Normies. No, I'm a cheap date.
Tell me why you've chosen Pizza Express. I mean, we could have gone cheaper, couldn't we? It could have been Greggs.
It could have been Greggs, it could have been Burger King. All of those are places I like very much. Pizza Express does actually have a kind of personal resonance for me, because my dad, who is the book's dedicatee, and who died in 2022 while it was being written, to my great sadness.
Sorry to hear that.
He worked, when he was probably quite a bit younger than me now, he worked for Pizza Express. He worked for Peter Boiseau, and he ran a franchise of Pizza Express in Walton-on-Thames. And so it was a big part of my life from a very young age. And on Friday nights, we used to have pizza and video evenings where the whole family would go and get Pizza Express takeaways and sit at home and watch a video. Your younger listeners won't know what that is, but it's a thing you had before Netflix. Also, one of my dad's great and enduring claims to fame, and I love him for this, is that he invented Pizza Express's garlic bread.
No.
Yes, he did. While he was running Walton-on-Thames, he went, well, what if we just took a pizza crust or flattened out some pizza dough and brushed it with garlic butter and cooked it? And they started doing that. And it became one of the most popular items on the menu, and they went to Pizza Express head office and said, you should roll this out.
Wow, well, there's no point making this an admission. I mean, it's no secret that you are the son of the famous Prue Leith.
It is a secret, or at least it's an untrue thing. Prue Leith is my aunt. My father was Prue Leith's brother.
Apologies. Still, baking and innovative things with breads.
Food is in the family.
So you made out that somehow this was a choice based on pure thrift.
Well,
and actually, it goes so much deeper. I mean, it's wonderful that you brought in those memories of childhood, because your latest book, the book we're going to be talking about over dinner this evening, The Haunted Wood, A History of Childhood Reading, really is all about those sacred memories from childhood as a reader, not necessarily as a pizza eater.
There's a lot of food in it. You know, kids are greedy, and stories that appeal to children often, particularly, you know, that cliche post-war cream tea with lashings and lashings of ginger beer, fantasizing about feasts. You think of Oliver, the hot sausage and mustard, the Enid Blyton's lashings of ginger beer and kind of post-war austerity years. But the idea of these sort of plentiful midnight feasts, you know, Harry Potter's feasts at Hogwarts. There's a wonderful picnic in The Wind in the Willows, where there's so much stuff in it that it all gets crammed together into a kind of one-word paragraph.
It's a very busy night I'm seeing around me, and it's peak tourist season here in London. So we're up against a lot of competition in terms of getting the attention of the waiter. Having grown up with Pizza Express, I suspect that you have your favourites, the things that you absolutely must order each time.
Yep, I do vary them a bit, but like most people who go to Pizza Express, you know, more than once a year, I have some favourites. So it tends to be the American hot for me, unimaginatively enough. But, you know, last time I was here, I had a calzone. Who knows? Anything could happen tonight.
All right, okay. Well, is the famous garlic bread here too? We have to order that if it's on the menu.
I think we certainly should. It is. It's now always comes with mozzarella by the look of it. But yes, garlic bread with mozzarella. That's the one. Wasn't mozzarella in my dad's day, but you can see dough balls now, a whole section all to their own. It's very sad to think. I mean, it's, you know, these things pass away, and my dad's garlic bread is at one with Nineveh and Tyre.
Well, for my part, the badana has always been a favourite of mine from the menu.
Oh, there's so much good stuff.
Yeah. Let's start our book talk with this. You write, quite close to the end of the book, the following. You say that in September 2023, the UK's National Literacy Trust charity released a disheartening report. Children's writing at crisis point as enjoyment among pupils drops, said one newspaper headline of its findings. More than half of UK children don't read in their spare time, said another. The charity's annual survey of attitudes to reading in children aged between 8 and 18 found that 56% of their respondents said that they didn't enjoy reading recreationally, a change for the worse for more than 15% since 2016. Among boys, the figure was higher than among girls. Among children on free school meals, the figure who didn't enjoy reading was more than 60%. The charity called it an all-time low statistic since we began surveying children in 2005. Now, admittedly, 2005 wasn't that long ago, but when I read this, I feel as though I got a sense for maybe what spurred you to write the book. There's an urgency to writing about children's literature at the moment, would you say?
Well, I mean, I needed to address what was going on now in the book, towards the end of the book. It's a history more than it is a kind of call to arms. And certainly the idea that by writing a 500-600-page book of history or literary history, I'm going to persuade 5-year-olds to pick something up is a forlorn hope. I think there'd be other ways of encouraging children to read.
But their parents, perhaps?
But their parents. Well, I would hope that the book is intended to... it's intended to do a number of things, but one of them is to remind readers of each generation, because it goes through a long period of time, of the things that have given them pleasure in their own childhood, and to make them think about what they might want to read to their own or read with their own children. I mean, it's not a campaigning book, really, but I'm discouraged, of course, by that sort of statistic. But I think something quite complicated is going on at the moment, because, you get statistics like that, but you also get a children's publishing industry that is more buoyant in some ways than it has ever been. The so-called Harry Potter effect. And I kind of closed the book not long after Harry Potter. Kind of changed the game for children's publishing. Suddenly, there was lots of money in it. Lots of children were reading. I mean, a lot of what they were reading was Harry Potter, but it spilt over. Adults started reading children's books. Children's books are now published with enormous prestige and pomp and confidence, and I think more and more published kind of almost than ever before. And there is fabulous stuff out there. Is it being read? I mean, presumably it is at some level if it's still profitable to publish it. And there are a lot of anxieties we have. You hear people moaning a lot about celebrities who diversify into children's writing as a sort of brand extension rather than a literary project. And undoubtedly that happens. Where there's money, people will find ways of leveraging, celebrity in an age in which celebrity is a very strong currency. But the case I would make is that the anxiety we've got, as ever, is children aren't reading because there's this new thing. And that happened in the 50s and 60s with television. There was a great kind of paranoia, and as I quote in the book, a Roald Dahl poem. It's one of the choric interludes in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where he says, essentially television is destroying children's minds. What you have to do is ignore their wails and howls, throw the rotten television set on a skip, and install a nice bookshelf in their room, and everything will be all right. But that anxiety proved not only to be kind of overstated in its own age, it proved to be kind of actively wrong. In the last generation, where it was kind of possible to have a sort of double-blind controlled experiment into the effects of television on children, just as 1 in 5 houses had television, I think it was like 1954, there was a thing, the Nuffield Foundation commissioned a sociologist called Hilda Himmelwhite to produce a report into the effects of television on children's behaviour, how much of their leisure time it ate and what made way for it. And she found there's an initial drop-off, and then they start reading again. And that they found in the medium term, children who were minded to read, and obviously varied according to socioeconomic status and sex and all sorts of other things, they would come back to reading, and what's more, television ended up kind of complementing their reading diets and even encouraging it. And I know when I was growing up, a lot of my reading was kind of in partnership with television in some ways. I'd see an adaptation of, C.S. Lewis or whatever on the telly, and that would send me to the books. Or I'd love Doctor Who, and I'd read Terence Dix's Doctor Who novelizations. So, television, many of us, you're maybe not at quite the same age, but will remember Jackanory, where television became another means by which books were read to children.
I remember Jackanory, and I agree. As a 90s kid, my reading was very much in partnership with television. The new anxieties, and again, I know that this isn't a campaigning book, so I do want to focus on the history that you give. But to the extent that, as you say, there are statistics that come out that concern you, the new anxieties are based around new media, particularly social media, particularly things like TikTok. it would be interesting to see if in another 50 years anxieties like this prove to be as wrong as they were about television 50 years ago.
What I was going to say was, I don't, and I do say in the book, I don't think we can be completely complacent. I think we can recognise that, if you like, 1960s and 70s television was a different kind of proposition from the sort of extraordinarily sticky, neurologically exciting, I don't like to throw around the word addictive, but in that ballpark.
Well, yeah, it's slot machine media.
The slot machine media are a different proposition, and I think we're going to have to wait and see. But when I was growing up, I was mad for video games, still am, and that didn't stop me reading. And I think my view of it really is that there are things that fiction, that storytelling in prose can do that television can't do, that film can't do, that even the most sophisticated, and I speak, as I say, in no way as an opponent of video games, I love them, that storytelling media like video games cannot quite do, and that social media doesn't do. And it's a slower burn, but it's a sort of richer one, and there are aspects of interiority and of a different sort of interactivity that are to be found in books. The generation that came to Harry Potter didn't really have social media, but it did have video games out the wazoo, and that didn't stop it, going crazy for Harry Potter. So I think my theory really is that once the hook's set, children will read. Once they see that there's something there they can't get elsewhere, they'll read. And I'm very against the idea that we need to sacralise classic texts, that we need to sacralise so-called chapter books. I think you go to where the children are. The hook is pleasure. And, I'm now a literary editor for a magazine. I'm in my career writing about, fiction and about books, generally of a kind of, semi-quasi-highbrow level. Literary fiction is most of what newspaper book reviews tends to focus on. And, what grew out, that lifelong engagement grew out of reading a shit ton of X-Men comics. Indeed, the Booker Prize winner Marlon James, when I interviewed him a few weeks ago, was talking about how much he had been influenced by Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men in the work he did as a Booker Prize winning literary novelist. So, comics, film novelizations, Nancy Drew, just as long as you're turning the pages, you'll find your way to the next book. And I think, like my 10-year-old, he doesn't really dig chapter books. He finds them hard to get into, he finds them boring. But what he loves is the sort of halfway to comic stuff, which is like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Jeff Kinney's wonderful series of books about suburban American life. Very funny and beautifully, amusingly illustrated. Or Louis Stowell's Loki books, which again, a lot of action going on the pages. Bunny versus Monkey, basically a comic. But, he will happily sit down with those and read them. And I think these things are gateway drugs. I think the trick is not to set a sort of high bar for entry and say, if you're not doing this right, you're failing. You just start where you are and go.
So where do we begin in the history of childhood reading, children's literature? You said earlier that the way to get children into reading is through pleasure. Find the thing that brings pleasure and run with it. Was pleasure always the hook? It seems to me that children weren't always considered those whose pleasure was of great importance.
Well, kind of. I mean, the funny thing about it is that, and my book starts way back in the mists of prehistory. But the sort of funny thing is that there isn't really children's literature as we think of it now until quite late in the day. I mean, the big bang of modern children's literature is, the middle of the 19th century with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, sorry to give it its proper title, and The Water Babies and Tom Brown's School Days. And kind of for the previous couple of centuries, for the most part, it has been in the hands of these kind of rather joyless and austere Calvinists, for whom the purpose of it was to essentially frighten original sin-infested children into getting God and putting aside dangerous, soul-imperiling activities like, hoop and stick or running up and down on the Sabbath or playing leapfrog.
Exactly. The Victorian age is often credited with the invention of childhood, isn't it?
Well, exactly. And that question about the invention of childhood, is central to the project of the book, because my argument in the book is that, you learn from what adults, because it is adults who write children's books, you learn from what adults wrote for children, how adults conceptualize children. You learn about the history of childhood. So you can use a literary history as a window into social history. Now, I think the strong claim, I'm not a professional social historian, but there was a sort of idea that children or childhood didn't exist until the early modern period. So Philippe Ariès, the medieval historian, has a sort of notorious line where he says something like, for medieval people, childhood did not exist. And I think intuitively that's basically bollocks. I think I put in the book that, you can, to little Lewis, my son, the dedication of Chaucer's treatise on the astrolabe, you can feel the tenderness in that. And we know, and I was talking recently to the medievalist Amy Jeffs, and she said, and the pearl is a kind of heart-piercing lament for a dead child. I think what changes is that childhood becomes a sort of space. Essentially, for children's literature to thrive, you need a couple of things to happen. You need a concept of childhood which kind of considers it as something more than just a, brief transitional phase to be got over as quickly as possible, whereby children just miniature adults. You need a readership, which is to say, essentially you end up needing literate children to make a market for you, and a space in which it can be shared, because, of course, for a lot of human history, the moment children were old enough, they're up a chimney or married to cement some dynastic alliance, or chucked out into the field to scratch and scrape. And so the spread of universal education, the ideas that started to kind of coalesce around children needing to play rather than needing to work. All of these track into a kind of widening market, if you like, in the 19th century for children to read and to be considered as children and to have fun.
But how far back do we go to get to the very beginning?
Well, to get to the very beginning, one of the arguments of the book is that children's writing was and remains closer to the kind of fountainhead of archetypal stories that form the basic storytelling tradition, so the oral tradition. Folktales and myths will have been the first things that children, most children's first encounters with narrative through human history. We know that cut-down versions of particular sort of mythological stories were what children used to, were given to children to read in the ancient world. The purpose there was not to entertain them so much as often to teach them Greek, to teach them rhetorical techniques. But, I think they recognised even then intuitively that if it's got a good story, if it's got some colour in it, the children will respond better. Of course, folktales and myths originally were for indiscriminate audiences. They weren't something you told children. They were something everybody heard, in the sort of apocryphal cave mouth, or the little hut in the village where the family lived and shared space with, pigs and sheep or whatever it was. Wouldn't have had a sort of separate nursery where Nanny went and spoke to the kids. If someone was telling a story, they'd tell it to everyone.
Yeah.
And the domestication of folktales is, I think, in some ways the beginning of children's literature, because you get people like the Brothers Grimm and Giambattista Basile in Italy and Perrault in France writing these things down and tweaking them and particularising them. Because oral stories, they exist in any number of versions. They're a kind of smear of story shapes and patterns and archetypes. And then they become more and more specific as they're written down. But the Grimms, originally, again, it's kind of easy to forget, they weren't writing their folktales down for children. It was kind of ethnographic projects. They were trying to essentially kind of corral a kind of German culture, German oral culture. And those early ones, if you look at the original Grimm's tales, they're very much not for children. So they're incredibly violent and weird. But they did successive editions. There's eventually, I think it's a 12th edition or something. They were sort of cut down and tamed, and they'd gone from, hard R to PG, and they started to acquire, it was shorter and smaller and more friendly, and it acquired pictures. And the Grimm brothers and Perrault and all the others became sort of children's stories, if you like. Also, I think that at that stage, the novel then starts getting going, and so the narrative tradition goes off in a different direction for grown-ups.
You mentioned there the shapes of stories, the archetypes, the genres, and how we organise the history of children's literature.
And it's
a good thing this isn't campaigning children to try to read more, because I tell you, an 8-year-old is not getting through all of this.
No, they're absolutely not. It's nearly 600 pages long, but I, all the way through it, and even now, endured agonies of anxiety about what I had left out.
But with all that you did include in the book, when you write about, as I say, the shape of those narratives and also the genres, the way that we understand and distinguish a fable from a fairy tale, how do we get through the lexicon of children's literature? How do we make sense of it?
Very good question. I have a sort of pet distinction I make. It's kind of homemade. But my rough argument is that we talk semi-interchangeably about fairy tales and folk tales and myths. And my rough argument is that folk tales and myths are both essentially oral forms. And they're forms where there's something that endures and that can be repurposed with wonderful plasticity across time and between cultures and across space. But the nature of the thing that endures is slightly different in what I'd think of as a folktale and what I think of as a myth. Myths tend to be, they've got a kind of grandeur to them, which folktales don't. Folktales tend to be quite close to the ordinary world. And even though folktales contain magical elements, almost always, those magical elements are weirdly, they're kind of part of the furniture of an ordinary world. Folktales are quite kind of ground up. They're a woodcutter, and they're the forest, and people have, if you like, normal medieval peasant type jobs in them. And the witch, magic is a sort of everyday technology. Whereas myths tend to have, they deal with the doings of sort of something a bit more numinous, kind of gods and monsters, and they take place above the ordinary human life world. And I think what they have in common is a fairy tale, a folk tale, begins formulaically once upon a time and ends happily ever after. That what unites the versions of a given folk tale essentially are the shape of the story. It's got a kind of particular story arc, which can be, the rags to riches, or the, princess is sleeping in a Cinderella-style ashes and then is saved by the handsome prince.
So Cinderella would be an axiomatic example of
That'd
this.
That'd be a classic folktale, but and there's huge scholarship on this subject. Myths, as I say, seem to me a bit more open-ended. When you talk about the myths, the Greek myths, what's common to those is not the shape particularly of a given story within them, it's the constellation of characters. I think of, for example, the modern examples would be Marvel Comics, right? The Marvel Universe is profoundly mythological. But, unless you're a really, really die-hard nerd, you don't really remember what stories, what the storylines that have taken. The storylines are kind of accidental. What's fundamental is that Wolvie is always going to have claws that go snicked. The Fantastic Four is always going to be the big guy, the stretchy guy, the invisible girl, and the guy who's on fire. that there's a sort of absolute open-endedness to those things. So I think children's stories, the best of them, draw on a bit of both of those things, in as much as they have the sort of story shapes of fairy tales, and they have some of the grandeur and endurance of myths. Peter Pan is absolutely nailed on a mythological character, and he survives, even though probably many of us would struggle. I mean, I wouldn't so much because I've been studying it, but to tell you exactly the story of Peter Pan. In fact, the storyline of Peter Pan changes in the different versions that J.M. Barrie himself wrote, let alone the ones that followed.
Right, it went through several different titles, didn't it?
Endless iterations, endless forms. It started out as a chapter in a grown-up book.
It was originally called Wendy and Peter.
I'm going to forget this myself, but it was originally a chapter in a book called The White Bird, which was an adult book, but it contained this chapter in this novel. And then I think it was Peter and Wendy was the next one. No, Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens was the next one. I think that then became Peter and Wendy. But again,
then it just became Peter Pan.
I'm losing my... Well, it's often titled Peter Pan, and it's apocryphally described as Peter Pan. I don't think any of the books actually were called just Peter Pan.
The term Peter Pan now is used to describe a hopelessly immature man who doesn't want to settle down.
Well, it's a book about loneliness. I mean, what's amazing about Peter Pan, if you go back and read it, is how extraordinarily violent and weird it is, which is true of an awful lot of those children's stories we haven't read. But also, I mean, he's described in the book as the tragic boy. And the kind of archetypal, like the origin story of Peter Pan, is he flies away because little children start out with being able to fly and speak the language of birds in Barry's fantasy. But he flies out of the nursery and goes off to the centre of the round pond in Kensington Gardens. Neverland's a later addition. And then when he finally makes his way back, he finds that the window's shut. And he can't get back in, and he can see his mother crying. And he can't go home. It's about a little boy who's trapped in childhood, but is also trapped without a mother. And the whole story of Peter Pan's relationship with Wendy in those later iterations is that, Wendy leaves. And she tries to take the lost boys with her. And Peter is, he's kind of traumatized. He's a motherless child who can never quite find his way home. So it's actually quite a desolating book, really. And this phrase that he uses once or twice in the first novel version, he talks about Peter being gay and heartless. Because Peter there's a kind of brittle happiness to him.
I love the story of Peter Pan growing up. A lot of the tragedy of that character was lost on me, not least because these stories, the longer they've survived, the more easily they are repackaged to present a cheerier picture of the world, of childhood, of the characters involved. And this is all thanks, I think, probably to American optimism and the magic of Disney.
No, Disney is... It's kind of a huge deal in my book, because my book isn't about Disney. But Disney is... I don't want to say the villain of the piece, because that's too... that's maybe too adversarial. But what I found was going back to the originals of many of these stories is that they had been thoroughly Bowdlerized by Disney versions, and that the originals were wilder and stranger and more interesting. And, I mean, to be honest, the point at which I really got bugged was when I was going through the children's books in my, the board books in my kids' rooms. My kids are a bit older now, but, obviously when they were 3, 4, 5, 6, we had tons of board books. And one of them, I found it's The Jungle Book, the original story, it said. And this is a board book by Walt Disney. And I looked through this. I said, the original story, The Jungle Book, the original story. Nowhere, anywhere in this little board book about Mowgli were the words Rudyard or Kipling. He had been completely erased.
Does a conspiratorial part of your brain think that Disney has tried to metabolize the British influence on children's literature in a sort of post-war New Empire style?
Well, metabolize is a very good word. I don't think of it as a form of cultural imperialism. In some ways, I think of it as what it is, which is these stories behaving like their ancestors, the ones that really stick. are massively available for reinvention and retelling. And the ones that take on a kind of mythological grandeur, characters like Mary Poppins or Mowgli and his friends, or in our own age, Harry Potter, you realise, you can see children doing it themselves with fanfic now. These fictional worlds invite reversioning, and that's what stories have always done. Why I find it noisome, and as I say, I don't think of it as kind of cultural imperialism quite, though no doubt they do Americanise somewhat. It's more that, as I say, the particularity and the interest of these stories, that sort of seeing them clear in themselves becomes harder. So Mary Poppins is much more unsympathetic a character in P.L. Travers' books than she is in the Disney movie. I mean, she's a sweet, nice, twinkly Julie Andrews. In the book, she gaslights the children constantly. She's incredibly vain. She's very quick to anger. She's a howling snob. I mean, she's a really interesting figure. Really is a little god, but a kind of quite capricious and frightening little god. And, Tinkerbell in Peter Pan is virtually a kind of homicidal maniac. There's a sort of stately quality to the adventures of Mowgli and the others in the Jungle Book that isn't there in the kind of slapstick Disney. Trying to think what else has Disney ruined. But
while you're thinking, I mean, I suppose really what I want to pick your brains on is whether or not you think that the more complex, ambiguous, and often sadder, crueler depictions of life and characters that you find in the original books would have been on some level better for children versus the unrealistically painless world that Disney has portrayed.
One of the things that I found fascinating in preparing this is the wild swerves we've seen through history as to the question of what children need and the didactic purposes of children's literature and the question of worldview that's being put forward. And in some generations, it's about featherbedding them. It's about the idea that children are these sanctified innocents. In other generations, as I think I've mentioned, you get these kind of hellfire preachers who say the thing to do is to scare the shit out of the children. We know that, up until probably the late 19th, early 20th century, children's stories were darker and more violent. A lot of the swerves have been precipitated by shifts in the way we think about children. And the arguments are still going on. I mean, Mary Blackman, who I talk about in the book, is a wonderful writer, sort of the breakthrough writer of colour for children in this country, long after we should have had one, but, and she deals with some quite dark materials in her Noughts and Crosses books, including one in which a young girl is being groomed to be a suicide bomber. And she wrote in her memoir, she said, over the years, I've had endless parents telling me this is not suitable for children. But I've never had a child say that.
Wow.
And
that's such a powerful observation, isn't it?
Well, I think what it is that, A, we will tend from time to time to underestimate the resilience and robustness of children.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It's true, isn't it, that children come to literature with a lot less fear and apprehension than adults do. Adults are experts at avoiding things that they find uncomfortable. Children are the ones that really are open to anything and can take it.
I think that's often true. I also think that the kind of putting children into a kind of pedestal of making them holy innocents, which is a kind of post-romantic swerve. When the Puritans lost the field, you get Locke and Rousseau saying, let children be children, let them grow according to nature. And then the Romantics, you get Wordsworth, Heaven lay above me, and that kind of drives towards a complete reversal, where instead of children being repositories of original sin and little beasts who need to be protected from the devil, they become a rebuke to the adult world, and you get the sort of simpering little Lord Fauntleroy archetypes, and the water babies in which Tom is sort of the little chimney sweep is kind of shriven of his sins in the water. And so that idea of children as a rebuke to the adult world, so I think quite often when we're trying to censor children's stories or trying to make them nicey and cotton woolly, what we're doing is protecting not children, but an adult fetishization of childhood innocence, an adult idea that we find very precious about what children are like. And it's really in the 20th century a bit more that you start to see people sort of seeing children as they are. I mean, I think adults also find uncomfortable is recognising quite how enthusiastically children respond to cruelty and violence. And, you know, there's that lovely bit in Shakespeare in Love, a sort of cameo where I think they're talking about Titus Andronicus, and Shakespeare meets this little 10-year-old and say, you know, what did you think of it? And he goes, oh, I loved it. I love when they got a hay spear with the axes. And when she... And he goes, oh, what's your name? And the kid goes, John Webster, which obviously is a nice early modern theatre in-joke. But there's a little John Webster in all of us, you know. I mean, the fascination with blood and guts, the you know, Darren Shan's very, you know, schlock horror Demonata series have sold tons. You know, we know kids, and I think, you know, the recent argument about Roald Dahl and the cruelty in Roald Dahl, I think that's stepped around the problem that if you take out the cruelty and the aggression in Roald Dahl and the sort of baroque punishments visited on the people that the narrative has decided are baddies, you take out quite a lot of their appeal to children.
But what do you think of this perhaps more recent phenomenon, which is the way that children's storytelling, again, very much in the Disney tradition, but perhaps borrowing from things like The Simpsons. I'm thinking here of the archetype of Lisa Simpson, the incredibly precocious, genius child. The phenomenon of Greta Thunberg is in some ways a very Disney phenomenon. This idea of the child who, wise beyond her years, enters the adult arena to round up the parents and the ministers and the world leaders in a room and tell them how stupid they are and how wrong they've got it all. And you see this in a lot of sort of Disney confections. We seem to have swapped places with where the Calvinists were. The children are no longer sinful and the adults benevolent and wise. It's now that the adults are corrupt and sinful and the children are the ones that see the light.
That's a legacy or a new twist on that post-romantic inversion of the Calvinist thing where suddenly children were beacons of innocence and that innocence needs to be preserved and children knew more than adults. That comes and goes. You know, children need to basically be in a situation where either the adults are too dumb to understand what's going on and the children are the ones who are going to save the day, or the parents have to be out of the way altogether, which is why, however much, you know, we may complain that the children's stories of the past are very, you know, normative in terms of class and family structure. They're not very normative in terms of family structure because the parents are almost always dead. You know, you need to get the parents out of the way because if there's some crisis or adventure to be had and you can turn around and say, Mum, can you solve it? Or Dad, can you help? There's no story. You need to get the... My friend Piers Torday, who writes children's books, has said he thinks there should be a national day of remembrance in which all children's authors should get together and, you know, hold a little ceremony kind of apologising for all the parents they've just brutally and insouciantly killed off in the opening page of their books. I think the best example, to my mind, the immortal one, is in James and the Giant Peach. Roald Dahl disposes of James's parents by having them be eaten by a rhinoceros. Which, yes. This is just kind of a side. But this is an inheritance, obviously, from fairy tale, because in fairy tale, as often as not, the parent, one or both of them, are out of the scene. And, you know, Cinderella's situation is James and the Giant Peach's situation. If, you know, Cinders loses her mum, she ends up with a wicked stepmother. James loses both of his parents to that unusually carnivorous rhinoceros. He ends up with these two horrible aunts.
But it's telling that the current most popular, at least dramatised adaptation of a Roald Dahl novel is Matilda.
No, that's a good example. I mean, Dahl in Matilda, instead of having the Dursleys being the Aunt Spiker and Sponge, you know, he just said, oh, we'll make the parents the Dursleys, effectively. You know, I mean, obviously, that's getting my timelines juggled up a bit. Okay, I mean, you know, going to boarding school is another way of getting the parents out of the way, but what all children's stories need to do is to open a space for action, where the children have, and of course this is the fantasy of children, more agency than they do ordinarily, because the life of a child, you know, you go to school, you come home from school, your mum and dad do most stuff for you, you can't go away to sea, You can't fight dragons. You can't, become a pirate. You can't, travel through dimensions. You need to get the parents out of the way for the adventures to start. So either you have the parents absent and, a series of secondary antagonists who will need to be escaped from, like the Durslys or Altspacking's Sponge, or you make the adults stupid or horrible. And so the child's actions can take place in a world that isn't quite visible to the adults, but might be along one side of it. And I think that is the sort of the sine qua non of all these adventures. The kid needs action. I mean, the other way they do it is portals. You fall down a rabbit hole. You're in Wonderland. You're in Neverland. You're somewhere away from the parents.
And that's where we come to the title of the book. In the whole tapestry of children's literature history, you chose the trope of the haunted woods, and I want to know why.
Well, what I mean by the haunted wood isn't completely stable in the book. The phrase is lifted from the wonderful, wonderful Auden poem that I use as my epigraph.
Perhaps we can have a reading of that poem.
Okay. It's a stanza from September 1st, 1939. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. And the reason I wanted to use that as an epigraph was multiple. One was that, as I say, my thesis in the book is that all these stories have at their root, and don't, if I'm honest, always stray all that far from fairy tales. And the archetypal fairy tale scenario is that trip into the wood. And the woods are a place where the characters go to have their adventure, and it's scary, but it's also exciting, and they return changed. They make the hero's journey. And I wanted to have that sense, which I feel quite strongly, that children's stories contain excitement and adventure, but they also are often deeply suffused with sadness and a very faint sense of, you're going into the woods in the dark at night, because children's stories are always kind of beckoning you to being a grown-up. But at the same time, they're written by grown-ups who are often kind of mourning, quite explicitly in the book, the losses of childhood. I mean, they're either making a compensatory fantasy for an awful childhood of their own, or they're mourning the loss of a wonderful childhood that they can never return to, and are looking for something in children in childhood that suits a very adult longing. And so that sense in the Auden poem of the child in the adult, and of the idea that stories take you somewhere that's going to be new and exciting, but it's also a little frightening, and that contains magic, and that isn't completely safe, is certainly one of the things I kind of guided by in that book.
Sam, how was the garlic bread? Did it live up to your father's legacy?
I think it did. It was nice to see it still there, albeit now slathered in mozzarella, which was never the way when I were a lad.
Never had a guest with a familial connection to a dish. This is very special. Thank you very much for being my guest on this episode, for talking about The Haunted Wood. It's a wonderful, extended and complex reading list for parents, isn't it? If they really want to know what's good, they'll open this book.
There's a bit of that. I mean, it's in a way, it's a long string of book reviews united by thematic material. But yeah, a lot of it is me wanting to say, which is what I do as a literary critic, week in, week out, point at something and say, this is the good stuff. And that's what I've tried to do in this book.
Sam, thanks very much.
Thanks very much for having me, Jack. It's been a pleasure.